Zanette Leroux. I'm the program director this year for the Reverberations of Inequality workshop. Thank you for coming. It's a busy time of year, and we appreciate you coming out to hear this very prominent younger scholar, Alexis Harris. Alexis received her bachelor's degree from the University of Washington, was a sociology major, and then went on a great choice, and then went on to get a PhD from University of California, Los Angeles. She spent her career at University of Washington, where she's now a professor, and she's the author of How the Flesh, Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for Poor People, which is published as part of the American Sociological Association, the Rose monograph series by the Russell Sage Foundation. In sociology, there's something called public sociology, which is an effort to broaden and show sociological research for issues in daily life. And I believe that Professor Harris really exemplifies that in a very important way. Her work has been widely discussed in the press, including the New York Times, The Nation, The New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, Mother Jones, NPR, Seattle Times. And also, she has testified in a number of important settings, including the Washington State Legislature, the Washington State Supreme Court, the Department of Justice, the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and at the White House about racial and ethnic inequalities in the criminal justice system and sentencing practices. She's, in 2015, she was appointed to the Office of Justice Program Science Advisory Board, and also she's on an advisory board for the National Task Force on Fines, Fees, and Bail Practices. And she's also a member of the Washington State Academy of Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Alexis.
Thank you so much for that. Oops, it's not. I got it. My kids always say. Thank you. Thank you so much for that really nice introduction. I was like, whoa, who is that? That sounds nice. I appreciate that. And thank you for the invitation to come here and the wonderful support of getting here and the schedule and everyone taking time out of their busy days and a busy time of the year to spend time with me. I really, really appreciate the conversations we've had. I'd like to give an agenda. Where do I, or is this on?
Yes.
No.
There we go.
Perfect. So you can see sort of the roadmap of where I'm going to go. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of monetary sanctions across the United States, so we can sort of get a sense of what it is I'm talking about and sort of the statement of the problem, and also the context of mass incarceration and conviction, and so why the sentencing of financial debt to individuals is so important. And then talk a little bit about one of the chapters from my book that I call the Punishment Continuum, how punishment sort of is imposed differently across within the same state with the same law, which is really interesting in my mind. And then talk a bit about the law in action and bureaucrats and American values and how the discretion is used differently by different court actors depending upon their own individual orientation to traditional American values. And then finally talk a bit about moving forward, what the work I'm doing right now, and policy implications of the work, which I think is very important for those of us who work with real practical problems to at least suggest appropriate changes. So to give a little bit of context, and I'm sure many of us in this room are really aware of these statistics, but as we know, incarceration has increased by 500% in the last about 45 years across the United States, a dramatic rise in incarceration. And that long red line on the top isn't the border, that's the rate of incarceration in the United States per 100,000 compared to other industrialized countries in the United States. So we're doing something very different in this country. About 1 in 115 adults were in jail or prison in 2015. 2.2 million people are in jail or prison now. About 4.6 million people are on probation or parole. So just under 7 million people within this country are in some way being controlled by the government. And we do this in a very disparate way for individuals. I in history classes, I have young kids, we learned that the United States is exceptional. And I like to remind us that we truly are exceptional in the way in which we incarcerate people and put them behind bars. And in particular, in the way in which we do this for a certain population in this country. While 1 in every 91 white men in the age group between 30 and 34 is in prison, 1 out of every 42 Latino men are in prison, and 1 out of every 17 black men is in prison. So if we even just look in this room, we can say about 4 or 5 black men are in prison given the population in this room, which is a dramatic statement. And this is similar disparities for women. Black women are incarcerated at a rate that's 2 times of white women, and Latino women are incarcerated at 1.2 times that of white women. Sarah Shannon and her colleagues did an amazing feat with a paper using 2010 estimates and found that 3% of the adult population, but 15% of the African American adult male population has been to prison. So 3% of the US population, but 15%, or 13, I'm sorry, my eyes, 15% of the African American adult male population has been to prison. And 8% of the US male population is estimated to have a felony, but 33%, so 1 in 3 African American adult men has a felony in this country. So this is the context that I think is really important, the backdrop, if you will, for when we start talking about monetary sanctions that are imposed by the court. This is sort of one of the ways in which racial inequality is so important and profound in understanding who is actually carrying disproportionately the debt that I'm about to talk about. So when I refer to monetary sanctions, I'm just going to put these all up here. I have also referred to them in my work as LFOs, legal financial obligations, but now I sort of talk about the system of monetary sanctions. There are a whole sort of number of charges that people can receive upon sentencing. So one sort of type of fiscal sentence that we might be familiar with is restitution. And that's the charge that I receive if I stole your car and the judge wants me to try and make you whole. So you have to fix your car, you have to pay your insurance deductible. I might be charged that. And so I write my check to, or do my credit card to the clerk of the court, and then they reissue that money to the victim. So that's restitution. To make the victim whole is the aim. And then there's fines. And fines are supposed to be a punishment, felt like that of incarceration. And the fine is attached to a specific offense. So, for example, a DUI offense, driving under the influence, the first time charge, or fine, is $1,000 in Washington State. I do it again, and it's a $2,000 charge in Washington State. So that fiscal amount is supposed to hurt me, like being incarcerated hurts me. It's supposed to be a punishment. But then the rest, the fees, the surcharges, the interest, the costs, are all user fees. It's like paying to go to the dentist. You're paying for the service that you're receiving in terms of being arrested, prosecuted, and put behind bars. So fees are court fees, a $100 court fee for paperwork, a $100 collection fee of my DNA so it can go into a national database. Those are types of fees. Surcharges are sometimes unrelated to a crime at all. So Arizona has a surcharge. If I remember, it's 29% surcharge. So whatever my principal is, if my principal is $5,000 of fines and fees, 25% is added on top of that as a surcharge. Part of that surcharge, I think it's about 10% or 11%, is allocated to free elections process. And what that is if I want to run for a government, local government, and I meet certain criteria, I can tap into that pocket of money. So people who receive felony convictions, who can't vote for me, are helping to fund my local campaign, right? So that's a lot of surcharges go to non-criminal justice related expenses. And then there's interest. Prior to 2018 in Washington State, we had 12% interest on all of these fines, fees, and restitution. And that's been changed. The interest is only on restitution at this point. And then there's costs, payment costs. So we'll see, I'll show you the slide in just a sec. Every time I make a payment, I have to pay people pay $2.25 for a convenience fee, or costs for collections, things like that. So here are some more examples of specific state LFOs. So in Washington State, We have a mandatory $500, what's called a VPA, Victim Penalty Assessment. So every felony, regardless if there's a physical victim or not, someone is charged $500, $250 for misdemeanor, and there's a mandatory $100 DNA collection fee. So they just take a fingerprint upon conviction. There was a problem where judges, prior to last year, people would have multiple felonies over their life course. Judges would always, even though they knew they had felony convictions, charge them that $100 DNA collection fee, and they had to argue, your DNA doesn't change, unless you saw a recent New York Times article. I can talk about that later. Your DNA doesn't change, and so you can't recharge them. So the new legislation clarified you can only do the DNA charge one time. Cost of supervision. So Marion County, Florida charges $50 per day for jail or for prison. Washington State, we charge $50 per day for prison and at cost for jail. A lot of jurisdictions rent jail beds and they're charged, and so that charge can be passed on to people who stay in the jail. Other states have reasonable cost of imprisonment. California, I like to point out, I talk about this in the book, it's a little ironic, but they have a pay-to-stay system. So in some local, like Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, you can, if you're convicted and you can get a doctor's note that you have no communicable diseases, you can pay to be segregated from general population and wear a special outfit and have special services for paying $110. You prepay $110 per each day you stay in jail. People pay for their cost of appointed public defender. Frequently you pay an application fee to be assessed your degree of indigence, and if you're found to be indigent, then you can enter and get a public defender. But at the end of your conviction, one of my counties, judges would regularly charge $450 for your public defender. So you pay for that. And then Ohio mandates also the cost of prosecution. And then there's examples of interest and collection fees. This is just a small sort of glimpse of the types of charges that occur across the United States. I always like to dig into the states I visit. And I found your penal code here for your monetary sanctions. And this is just some examples that you have an interesting base rate, a surcharge. I could go down a rabbit hole, so I didn't spend too much time figuring out what that went to, but this is sort of what it looks like. And then that little picture shot just shows how people pay online and the different ways that they can pay. So there's these systems, third-party entities, right, private companies that provide these services and make money off of payments, which is also interesting, and we can talk about that in a bit. So it's important. Why does this matter? It matters because until you pay it off, you're sort of in this liminal legal space, right? You can't defer your prosecutions, which is really important. You can't carry weapons. You can't serve on juries. You can't seal records. There's a whole host of conditions that don't allow you to be fully free from the courts. You will remain on court supervision until the debt is paid, and that means warrants can be issued if you don't appear in court. It means you can be summoned to court frequently to report current financial standings and things like that. So it's not only a financial hardship for individuals, but in terms of time and surveillance by the court system, it's very heavy-handed. So I studied this a little bit early on, several years ago, and I decided I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper, and I wanted to think about how does the system of monetary sanctions operate across the United States? How does it compare to what's happening in Washington? What is the legal intent, right? There must be some payoff, literally, right? There must be some reason why policymakers have established this policy. What is the intent behind that? And then what are the positives and negatives of the system? And then how do decision makers process, label, monitor, and sanction people? How might the practice of this punishment vary? And how does social control look like from the ground level? So for individuals who owe this debt and have no sort of foreseeable date in which they think they can pay it off, what does that feel like for them? And in practical sort of day-to-day movement, how do they experience that? So the data for the book, I call it my kitchen sink in the appendix, but I was really interested in just talking to anybody who would talk to me at this time about monetary sanctions. So I interviewed people who had debt, and part of that was from a prior project with a colleague, but I added case studies. I interviewed judges, clerks, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and a handful of state representatives. I only indicate the numbers of people who were willing to sign my IRB form. I did talk to other people, but many of them didn't want to go officially on the record. I did observations of sentencing and sanctioning hearings. So I selected 5 counties in Washington state across the state, and I would sit in on the hearings where judges would convict, and then sometimes on the same day, sometimes it wasn't, there were the sentencing hearings. And I would see how much money judges would impose on individuals. And it was really interesting to see the variation across judges and also across the counties, even given the same law, differences in the amounts that were sentenced to individuals. I did a summary review of the national state monetary sanctions statute, and so I have a good working table of how the 50 states sentence fines and fees, detailed review of Washington state statute, and I had a sample of Washington state court automated data that I could sort of get a glimpse at average amounts and things like that across the state. In general, this is a summary of what I found across the nation, that 100% of the states have an option to impose some sort of fines and fees. So this is a common practice in state statutes that allow courts to impose financial amounts on individuals. 69% had a penalty for carrying a balance. So some advocates and litigators call this a poverty penalty, that this is an additional cost, that because you are poor and you can't pay your total amount off, you pay more. So just on the sort of the practical process, if you cannot pay it off the day it's sentenced, you will pay more than somebody who's wealthy. 71% charge for a public attorney. That's the defender that's appointed to you if you cannot afford one. Incarceration for non-payment, 92% of the states allow in some way to incarcerate, explicitly would say this, to incarcerate for non-payment, related to non-payment. 77% of the states allow for some sort of community provision. So if I owe $1,000, I could do community service at a rate in, say, Seattle Municipal Court at $15 an hour. And then I could work off my debt. And we can talk about this in the Q&A about whether or not I don't think that's a good idea. But 42% of the states clearly said that debtors could vote, that people who owe debt. With Florida, there's recent conversations with Amendment 4 around this. In Washington state in 2009, we have the provisional right to vote. So if you miss 3 payments in 12 consecutive months, prosecutors can petition the court to remove that provisional right. The problem is that there's a lot of uncertainty and people just don't know if they can vote under the change in law. So I am going to focus on chapters 5 and 6 of the book, just so you have some context of where I'm going. And the first is really talking about this notion of a punishment continuum and trying to understand how the law operates. As every state, Washington state has one state-level statute that governs the practice of monetary sanctions. Most states have one identifiable statute, like the one I cited in the previous slide for Pennsylvania, and it summarizes the general types of fines and fees and restitution that can be imposed. And then there are other statutes in varying locations all throughout. It's like a needle in a haystack to really try and find all of one jurisdiction's statutes. And so they might outline other allowable types of fines and fees that could be imposed. When I first began conducting research on monetary sanctions in Washington state, defendants with whom I interviewed provided very different accounts of their experience across the state. So much so that I didn't believe a lot of the stories that they were telling me, honestly. They were so egregious. And so I started calling community correction officers, which is the name we use for probation officers in Washington. And they said, oh yeah, people can go back to jail if they don't pay. We tell people to do work under the table. All of these stories that the CCOs confirmed, that there were varying county practices that ranged in both assessment amounts and sentencing practices regarding non-payment. So to better understand the system of monetary sanctions and how it operates, I decided to identify 5 counties in the state and study them via observations of sentencing and sanctioning hearings and the interviews with the people I talked about. I used pseudonyms for the counties, primarily because people were so forthcoming, and some of the counties were smaller counties, and the prosecutors and judges that I talked to were easily identifiable, even if I didn't give their name. So I decided, and people could, you know, if you really wanted to sit down and figure out which counties these were, but I wanted to give them a little bit of confidentiality as much as I could. But what you can see, and this is just aggregate values, but one county, the counties ranged a great deal in terms of the average amounts that were sentenced. So in one county, the average fine and fee sentence was $600. In another county, it ranged all the way to $2,500, and that's not controlling for offense type, so I get that there might be differences there. You can see the outstanding accounts. One county had over 120,000 accounts outstanding, so those unpaid accounts. Others had smaller sets of accounts. What's really interesting is the average amount collected annually. So in one county, it was about $39 annually on an open account. Now remember, the mandatory minimum is $600, and there's 12% interest at this time accruing. And other counties collected a lot more. And then there could be, again, a lot of other factors. But overall in Washington State in 2011, right, so 8 years ago, there was over $30 million that was outstanding. So the amount of money that was generated, if any, was very small amounts off of the backs of a lot of people paying minimum amounts. So despite the statewide, the statewide statute, there's extreme variation. Let's just make sure I get all this up there, in a lot of things. The range of sentence amount. So I would go and sit on similar types of cases, and judges would have a very different range in their sentences. There are great deal of differences in the monitoring of legal debtors. So like I said, in one county, judges would give the mandatory minimum $600 per felony conviction. In another county, I go down to just south, judges would give the $500 VPA, the $100 DNA, $200 court paperwork, $450 for your public defender. I mean, there's all of these other charges that were discretionary, but judges would impose them. So very different orientation of judges to the treatment of offenders across the state. There were differences in the monitoring. So in one county, judges wouldn't actively pursue debt unless they had a victim call a prosecutor, and then the prosecutor would advocate to the court that they are more harsh, put out a warrant, arrest, and bring them into court. But other counties had agreements with the local sheriff's office where they would do weekend roundups. And so they would go out for non-payment related warrants and pick people up. So you could go to that county, and I did, on any given day, and they'd say 7 to 8 or so people who were picked up purely because they hadn't been paying, and I could observe what the judge would say to them. There are also differences in assessment of who was a willful non-payer. In order legally to incarcerate someone related to non-payment, a court must find that the person had the means but willfully chose not to make a payment. That was established by the United States Supreme Court in Beard v. Georgia in 1983. But judges interpret willful very differently. So in some counties, a judge would look, well, you have a public defender, you're indigent, right? And so I'm not going to sort of send you to jail or find you that you willfully did not pay. Other judges, as I detail in examples in the book, look at consumption patterns. So if women had manicures, they would ask them, how much did you pay for your manicure? I saw one woman, she came in with a sleeveless shirt on and had visible tattoos. The judge asked her, who did your tattoos? How much did you pay? And I don't know if she knew where he was coming from, but she said, my brother did it. And all of them, so the judge would really push, right, trying to figure out where people might have spent money. Another prosecutor told me that he regularly asks people when they call and say, I can't pay, well, do you smoke cigarettes? How much do you smoke a day? How much do you smoke a month? And then tally that total and say, you could have made that payment, you're a willful non-payer. So there's a huge amount of discretion given the law on the ways in which prosecutors and judges can apply this willful non-payment. There are no criteria set by the Supreme Court for how they're supposed to apply the law. And then there's, like I said, variation in sanctioning. So some places, one county had it was called auto jail policy, and it was in the state Supreme Court. They called it auto jail policy. So what was happening was people would be picked up on non-payment. They'd be in jail. Clerks would go visit them with their clipboards and ask them to sign a statement saying that if they failed to make the future payment, they would automatically report to the jail and skip the hearing of willful non-payment, but automatically report to jail. And I was talking with the prosecutor, the defense attorney that described this to me. I said, well, why would somebody sign that? She Because they wanted to get out of jail. They had kids, they had a job, they didn't want to lose their apartment. So they sued. It was a nascent case in, I'll say, Spokane County, Washington, and it overturned the auto jail policy, so they had to stop doing that. But at the time I was in the courts, that was a regular practice. So using both the automated court data and observational and interview data, I find what I call a punishment continuum. This variation in local actors' orientation to the law and the application really created this continuum, varying degree of how people experienced punishment in Washington state, the variation in policies and procedures comprising the local system of monetary sanctions. So a county's location on the continuum is informed by factors informing sentence amounts, the local norms, legal and non-legal case characteristics, and county level resources, and the court actors' norms and values used to inform interpretation and application of legal concepts and to form local, formal, and informal policy. So that's depending on the county that someone was in. I always tell, when I teach my intro and I talk about monetary sanctions, I tell my students which county to get convicted in versus other. So depending on what county a sentence is in, one could be assessed a relatively minimal amount of fiscal penalties or a great deal of fiscal penalties. These findings imply that within the state, judges are interpreting and applying the state law in very different ways. And so this really turns the question to, how is this allowed to happen, right? We think, as sort of lay people think, right, people who don't study the law or the criminal justice system, we think that the law is the law and it's black and white, and that there's equality out there. And it's really not. There's a big disconnect between how policymakers establish the law, how it's interpreted, and then how it is experienced. So in contrast to the determinate justice that the Washington State Legislature sought to create in 1985, like a lot of other states nationwide, I argue that monetary sanctions, which were in Washington State formalized in 1989, are much more in line with the notion of a bureaucratic justice described here. The system operates within the local context and is informed not by the formal law, but by the local administrative needs and desires. As such, the local court community informs the contours of justice we see across Washington state as well as nationally. This analytic framework helps explain the connection between the law on the books, a single state statute governing monetary sanctions, and the law in action, the variation, and its daily implementation within the counties that I analyzed. So this is a bad slide for grad students. Don't do this when you present. But I meant to put this up there to show how overwhelming it is of all the responsibilities and control that court clerks have in our local courthouses. They, at least in Washington state and in other states I can talk about that we're doing research in right now, non-elected court bureaucrats have a great deal of control over the fate of people who are processed through our criminal justice system with very, very little accountability. And so what this means is, when I looked at my 5 counties within the state, is that there's really no process. And so this was the public defender that told me about the auto jail policy. And when I said, why aren't people challenging the auto jail policy prior to the court case? She said, because what's happening is you have one clerk that does it one way and another clerk that does it another way. And the clerk's office says that they're doing it under the direction of the prosecutors, but then when you talk to the prosecutors, the prosecutors say that they're just going along with the clerks, Your Honor. So you can't really challenge due process if you've got no process. If there's no local court rule, if there's no codified procedures as to how we're going to handle these and what the clerk's roles are, how does anyone ever come in here and say that they're being treated unfairly or differently than the guy who was just here the week before them? So the point is that there's really no structured process around monetary sanctions, and this allows for a great deal of individual discretion on the ground level. So an example of how that discretion is structured for some people is this notion of working deals. I always like to say, and usually I come to this at the end, but the people I interacted with were really nice people. And so they were very open and didn't feel like they were doing anything wrong. They felt that they were just doing what they were supposed to do within the system. So this court clerk was very open and honest with me. And he said, we definitely work deals with individuals if the cases are here versus in private collections, and they've made a good effort to make monthly payments. Do we give them the information up front? So do we help them with education? No. But if someone comes to the counter and they have, let's say they have $50 left to pay on their principal, and the interest for the last 6 years has accrued to the point, I've seen it in thousands of dollars, depending on how big the original case was. And the defendant says, is there anything we can do with this interest, and I'll say, yeah, there is, if we can get half of it waived. So this clerk was talked about the ways in which he makes character assessments of the individuals before him and whether or not he's going to help the person out. In this county, and it varies by counties, but in this county, they had public employees, clerks, collecting money, but they also partnered with private collection agencies. And so he turned his computer screen to me and showed me that he can actually access real time what the private collection agencies were doing with their clients that owed money. And in Washington, if your debt is transferred to a private collection agency, they can add up to 50% of debt onto that to make money. So he turned the screen to me and he pulled up one case and he showed me that the collection agents know every single contact, every attempt made with someone, and everything that person said. And so this guy told me, look, this guy, if he says F you, he's not a good guy and I'm not going to help him, right? So if he's not nice to the collection agent, then he's not going to help him and he's going to not work a deal. And then this instance was really interesting. This prosecutor sort of illustrates how individuals' values, norms, and assumptions permeate the decision making in related informal but very formalized processes within the county. We were talking about a man who had been on a warrant pickup in a park. It was a homeless man. I observed him in court. He was shackled both at the legs and at the hands, and he had an orange jumpsuit on. He comes before the judge on a non-payment warrant, which is $300 in that county. And the judge, the first thing he said is, "You have a right to an attorney. Do you want one here?" And he said, "No, Your Honor. I'm here because I can't pay my court fees. I don't want any more fees." So right there, he gave up his right to representation. And then the judge just said, "Do you admit non-payment?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm homeless." And I wasn't sure exactly what happened if the judge was going to release him. And so I asked the prosecutor, because this prosecutor would let me hang out with him in court and then I'd go and talk with him about cases afterwards. He said, yeah, he was released from jail. If they're truly indigent and can't pay, the court often will turn them loose. But individuals, even a person who's homeless, has got the ability to go and apply for a job. And that's one of the things I was suggesting to the court on that one guy. I said, have him go and show that he's making an effort to find employment. We also have people that stand alongside the freeway entrance and exits. And I said, with cardboard signs? And he said, yeah, with cardboard signs that say we'll work for food. You know how much money these people make sometimes. Some of these people make $100 a day. And I couldn't think of an objective researcher how to respond to that comment that I thought was so egregious. And I just said, wow. And he said, not all of them make that much, but there's good money to be made standing along the street corner and asking. So while the court actor explained that if you're truly indigent and can't pay, the court will turn them loose, he clarified that even homeless people and those sentenced to life in prison have the ability to pay something. During my observations in this court, I watched a defendant who was in stage 4 cancer, another who was homeless, and those with physical and mental disabilities, all assessed as having the ability to make LFO payments. Illustrated by the latter part of the above quote, in practice, in this court's ideology about holding defendants accountable and forcing them to work to pay their debt to society, regardless of their circumstances, comprised the punishment culture that drove the sentencing of monetary sanctions. As such, financial penalties were imposed as additional punitive measures. Defendants' efforts to make payments were viewed by court actors as defendants' attempts to make amends for their offenses. Here, defendants were viewed as accountable for their behavior if they raised money towards their LFOs, even if that meant literally holding a cardboard sign, begging for money by the side of the road. And I'll add, at least in Seattle, under Muni Code violations, that's a citation. You can get a ticket for that, right? So the way that I sort of frame this and think about it in the book is thinking about how American values and the ways in which individuals as court officers, their orientation to the people that they work with and process really inform how they're going to apply the law. So a strong notion among some of the court officers of individualism, that an assumption that individual people are fully responsible for themselves and their behavior. So there's no structural issues causing it. They have to individually make up. So as applied in the punishment realm, defendants should be accountable for themselves. They each have the ability to do so. Under a meritocracy, those who are most successful with status and wealth are those in society who work the hardest. So there's this expectations that defendants, even those who are dying, who are disabled, must work hard as everybody else in society. And a weird notion of paternalism that legislators and judges told me that they've created a system of accountability to help people make amends. So LFOs serve as a system to right fiscal and physical harm to society, but also to encourage non-offending. So it's like a parent setting up a system that you can work to get stars on the fridge for something, right? And that stars on the fridge is money to get your freedom. So thinking about this system in the broader context of our contemporary American criminal justice system, mass conviction and incarceration and the related consequences is important. Also, the understanding that defendants tend to be disproportionately poor, African American, Latino, and Native American, formerly educated, unemployed or underemployed, mentally ill, or physically challenged. With this recognition and the understanding of the system of monetary sanctions, I find that this is essentially a permanent punishment. There is no other population as disadvantaged as pre- and post-conviction and incarceration than American felons, and in particular African American men who encounter the criminal justice system. For all of these reasons outlined, the system of monetary sanctions is a particularly egregious practice and impedes the process of rehabilitation and assistance. Sometimes I say satirically, if I was Dr. Evil and challenged to create the perfect system of social stratification, this is it. The process perfectly labels, stigmatizes, financially burdens, and imposes further legal consequences to already a population who's been disadvantaged and marginalized. It perfectly sorts the already marginalized and further cements them to lives of inequality, and allows for perpetual state surveillance, intervention, and control of poor felons. The system, furthermore, by attaching such pernicious legal consequences for non-payment, the process allows for perpetual state surveillance, intervention, and literal control of lives. I'm not a conspiracy theorist necessarily, but if I were one tasked, as I said, to create such a system of social control, this is it. It's literally, we already have marginalized people under a high degree of surveillance. We stain them with a felony, and they have all the legal collateral consequences, and then they have the fiscal debt with the related consequence. The present day imposition of monetary sanctions is not as physically egregious nor as publicly known as systems of convict leasing and forced labor camps, but the system of legal debt has eerily similar practices and consequences for those marked with a criminal conviction, the political, social, and economic marginalization of life. Thus, the linkage between social control institutions that overselect for the poor and for people of color is cemented in both the history of criminal justice practices, but also in the United States, but also in its current practices. So I'll just talk a little bit, sort of moving forward and ways in which I've sort of framed this. In the book, I frame this issue, sort of a contemporary issue of social control and power. Thinking through social, economic, and political dimensions of the criminal justice system, we can think about how slavery, slave codes, black codes, convict leasing, forced labor, and now monetary sanctions really sort of are a similar process. So this is, so I didn't have this in the book, but it's sort of more for teaching and presentations. I'd like people to think about our history and really the short history that we've had, and sort of thinking about slavery and the owning of bodies where people were forced to labor, and their immediate, whatever they did that day, made profit for usually private citizens, corporations, to make money off of that. They moved to slave leasing, sort of leasing out bodies to make money, and then with the end of enslavement as we knew it at that time period with the 13th Amendment, it was outlawed only for those who were duly convicted. And so then we moved to sort of black codes, processes that easily allowed local jurisdictions to mark individuals, black bodies, right, with criminal convictions so that they could then do other labor. And at that point in history, we didn't have these large Department of Corrections facilities, right, our systems. And so people were leased out, convict leasing, again, to third-party entities to make money, private profits off of marginalized African-American citizens. But then, you know, Douglas Blackman has a great book about this, but it was too expensive, right, because people were dying because the forced enslavement was so harsh. So prisons were built, and states realized that they could make money off of forced labor within prison systems. So there's a history of social control. Two consistent things, right? It's primarily been racialized people and poor people, and it's also all about control of their labor and the types of profits that they could make. And then we move into monetary sanctions. And there are other ways that sort of we can think about this, the relationship between the criminal justice system and capitalism. More recently, I was thinking about the partnerships between private entities and public entities. I had a recent paper with 2 amazing graduate students where we sort of mapped out the ways in which third-party entities were able to come in, not just private prisons that people talk a lot about, but services that are provided, costs that many times people are forced to pay. But then I have a good colleague, Sarah Quinn, who's an economic sociologist, who said, Alexis, even your own work, the way that you frame this, is really about public-private partnerships. So from the get-go, from slavery, right, all the way through with convict leasing, there's always been some sort of partnership between public and private entities. So all of us, I'll end here on this slide. I think all of us in this work are thinking about ways, whatever we think about, in some way we can think about how monetary sanctions are related. And that's what I really love to talk about and encourage people to do. Stay in whatever your area you're studying, but think about how and where monetary sanctions might matter, particularly given the disproportionate impact on poor communities and people of color. If you're in the education system, healthcare, monetary sanctions are present, I bet you, if you get on the ground and start asking questions. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Oh, move over? Okay.
If you'd like.
Sure. Okie doke. Can you leave the slideshow up, just in case I want to go back? I have extras. So do I just take questions? Okay.
Yeah, please.
Any questions? Ideas? Sure.
In general, after all you talked about, what can the average citizen do to improve this?
So I'm bad with technology, so I'm just going to do this for a minute
Yep.
to get to the policy implications. So thank you for asking that question. I didn't get there. The average citizen can learn about what's happening within your jurisdiction. All criminal courthouses are open, so you can go to wherever your courthouse is and sit in on a sentencing hearing and see what's happening on the ground level. So that's one thing. You can become aware of local policy that's trying to be enacted in your state and your local jurisdiction. You can work with organizations. I particularly prefer to support organizations of people who are impacted by the criminal justice system and listen to their voices before I listen to anybody else and what their experiences are and what they feel like they need in policy change. You can write letters, you can write op-eds. There's a lot to become informed and spread the word about it. So one thing the way that I frame policy change, I mean, this has been, I started this work in 2007 with the Washington State Supreme Court, with the Minority and Justice Commission, and we finally had some form of comprehensive change in 2018. So that was 11 years. So making policy change takes a lot of time in your jurisdiction. And I think I realized, you mentioned that I was appointed to the National Task Force on Fines and Fees, and that was mostly like kind of big name judges and folks. And I was sitting in their room and I sort of came to this realization that I have kids, they have a coloring books, right? And they color within the given lines on a black and white page. And I realized that a lot of people were just changing the color crayon. Like maybe they change from red to blue or they make it a little bit darker, but their policy implications like these, they're helpful, and yeah, they will immediately help certain people, but they're not real big changes that we need. So when I talk about policy implications, because some people on the ground need these incremental changes, giving judges bench cards. A lot of judges don't even know the law. They don't know what is mandatory. They're just working off some knowledge that somebody told them. So having a laminated bench card in front of them at sentencing, this is what's mandatory, this is what's discretionary, this is how the questions you're supposed to ask. So bench cards are good. Developing different legal assessments, definitely we need policymakers within the statute to establish what is ability to pay. I prefer current ability, not future, because a lot of policymakers and judges imagine, well, they might win the lottery. They might get a settlement. Somebody might die and leave them money. So current ability to pay, assessments and criteria need to be established in state law. Establishing assessments for willful non-payment and what is excessive. We just had the case Timms, was it 2019 I think happened in the US Supreme Court around whether or not fines, fees, forfeitures can be applied to states, and it's found that it is. And so now courts kind of have a legal authority to start, or at least advocates within the states, to say that fines and fees are excessive. And what does that mean? And how do we measure what is excessive? And then practitioners, some of them, again, you have this huge amount of debts. I work with one judge where he'll do sort of a credit program. So if he has someone in his court who has a large amount of debt, well, is the person going to AA? So going to every AA meeting, you get $100. Getting your GED, you get $1,000. So he gets these credits. So, again, incremental. They're not dramatic changes. I was working with a group in Washington State through a grant that the Obama administration had seeded to create a payment calculator. I used to think that this was trivial. It's an app where we work with Microsoft to create, where the judges can see all of what's mandatory, then what's minimum, can put in the amount that the person, their living wage, and then calculate, okay, if I set $50 a month, $100 a month, how long will it take to pay off? And actually, judges need to see that. They don't realize, given their salaries and their lifestyles, really what somebody making $8,000 a year, right, has in terms of making payments. And then community service. I used to advocate, I actually have an article with Catherine Beckett where we advocated for community service translation. I'm not afraid to say I've changed my mind over time with new evidence that the barriers to making payments to LFOs are the same barriers that prevent people to fulfill community service. Taking the bus, having kids, having a mental health issue, having certain crimes that people don't want to be around you. I don't know if I said transportation. So there's a lot of barriers for that. And it's also people with money. I just don't like the idea that people with money can pay it, wipe their hands clean, and other people have to do hard labor, pick up trash, right? Because they're poor and can't walk away from their crime. So I'm not big on community service. Okay, so that's changing the crayon. I think that we need to erase the lines. So I think that we need dramatic change around punishment in general and the criminal justice system in general, but the system of monetary sanctions. So I think we need to eliminate all financial barriers in general. We have this strong sense throughout history, the timeline I showed us, of coupling money, finances, capitalism with punishment. And I don't clearly understand why people don't understand that if you don't have money, and you can never be accountable. You can never get out. You can never fulfill that punishment. So I really think that we need to eliminate any association with financial sentences to punishment in this country. I used to argue for day fines, but again, that's still creating financial. So I'm kind of moving away from that, given the conference. We had a conference recently and really interesting conversations there about that. A big thing is that people say, look, we need the money, right? And I argue in the book, looking at the expansion of state statutes, that because of mass conviction incarceration, jurisdictions just can't afford what they're doing. And so you see in the 90s and early 2000s, the statutes expanded. So they created more fees, mostly fees, and expanded the amount. So the jury, there's a jury fee. If I want to have a 12-person jury, I'm charged for it, right? So the jury fee has expanded dramatically. So I think we definitely need to address the budget concerns. So we need to fund court systems as needed, right? State legislatures need to do that. We need to revise the sentencing structure. So I think we need to revisit all of the people we're sending. In states where we've legalized cannabis, there should be no one sort of in our jails or prisons related to cannabis-related offenses. And I also argue we need to legalize cannabis. We've made $315 million in taxes just in 2017 in Washington, $315 million. So we're moving people from the system and also generating money. I think it's kind of a win-win with legalization of cannabis. So that's what we can do. Sorry for the long response. Yeah?
I think I remember from your book that you said that many people in the public support these fees and fines because they think they're going to victims and to survivors. So if you're taking your kind of abolitionist position to get rid of all fees and fines, what would you do about restitution?
Yeah, so I don't think many people, I don't know, I don't have any empirical evidence around what people in general think about fines and fees. I think I did say that the people I interviewed, they supported restitution. So people who caused crime to direct victims said that they wanted to pay their restitution off. So I think, and I try and stay away from when I do op-eds or media to read the comments because sometimes it's just not fruitful. But when I do read them, there's the typical people who say you do the crime, you pay the, whatever. So those people, I think they're hard to convince. But I think the vast majority of people, once they learn about this and that they learn that the system is being done in their name. And I was particularly interested in studying this because it's not a collateral consequence. It's not a social stigma that employers impose on individuals. This is what state legislatures purposefully created the system, right, to cement individuals in poverty. You know, in 2000, prior to 2000 in Washington State, people who had debt, felony debt, after 10 years it would go away. In 2000, state legislators sat together and voted to permanently, they call it toll for life. This was a purposeful decision. It's also sort of self-serving that it has practical, we can change this like overnight if they change the law. So it's kind of neat because you could see policy changes. So in general, back to your question, I think in general when people learn about the system and they see how difficult it is for real people, that they want to change it. And so that's why we've had this national momentum around bail in part, but also fines and fees in many states.
I guess what I'm still trying to understand, would you retain the restitution?
I think we need to think about restorative justice. I think that we're stuck in this box of how we think about criminal justice. And part of when I do these talks, I usually try and get people to think about what does punishment mean and what does sort of restoring the victim. We can never make a victim whole. We can't. With the trauma that's done, whatever type of crime it is, we can never make them whole, but what do they need? And so thinking through different types of restorative justice type programs that don't always couple money to the crime. And it's also important to recognize that that there isn't this straight black line between victims and offenders. That many people who make contact with our systems of justice are victims, have been victims, continue to be victims, are victims by being in our jail and prison systems. So I think we need to change our language. We need to really redefine what the goal is. If the goal is to permanently mark people and cement them to poverty, we're doing an amazing job, the best job in the world. So we need to recognize that. Or what can we think about to create, if we talk about redemption, I was talking with someone in our one-on-ones about this. Many of us on Saturdays and Sundays talk about redemption and how great it is, but we don't do it in practice, right? So what would that look like on the ground level? If it was your child, what would you want? I don't know. Okay, here.
Thank you so much for coming. I love your book and your talk and all the papers you've written. I'm very much a fan of your work. I was wondering, in terms of after the 2015 Ferguson report, which revealed policing for profit in Ferguson, especially amidst budget shortfalls and actual fines and fees as revenue for the municipality. I was wondering, throughout your work, in talking to administrators who impose, enforce, and collect fees, how much of their work is informed by maybe budget shortfalls or fines and fees as actual revenue for the court system, the municipality? I think a big deal of their justification for the system, if they can't find any other about accountability and punishment, is we need the money. I interviewed one judge who was the presiding judge of his county, and he said, look, I argued to my county council, I needed another judge, our caseloads are so big, and they said bring in more LFOs. So he made a direct connection between bringing in LFOs and getting the employees and what he needed in his courtroom. And this is just a common trope that clerks use and judges use in certain areas. But I always say, I task you with finding one jurisdiction that really has done an accounting of the amount of money they've recouped for fines and fees and the amount of money they've spent on incarceration, on processing, on controlling, pick up on warrant, all of that stuff. Like, no one has really done the dollars and cents of this. Yes, but the trope is there. That's definitely the argument to push back. And that's why I started talking about, well, let's talk about the budget then. The problem isn't the people who are coming before your court. The problem is the system that we're creating for ourselves. Like, you're too big when you order food and you have too much food on the table. Like, you have this sort of appetite for punishment and control of people, and we need to cut it back. We don't have to do it this way. Yeah.
Thank you. It strikes me that the general point is to draw attention to how the fines and fees are discriminatory and unfair, opaque, and very burdensome to marginalized communities. But then there's the specific issue of being incarcerated for inability to pay fines and fees. And the Bearden versus Georgia case makes it a principle that shouldn't happen if you can't pay, as you pointed out, there are these ways that the courts disagree about how to determine that, and also come up with standards that seem themselves to be very unfair and unrealistic about who has the ability to pay. Is it also a problem that the law of the Supreme Court from that 1983 case is simply just ignored altogether, and that there are some jurisdictions that don't even go through the process of making a claim that there is an ability to pay after all? Because the little that I've read about that case is that there's frustration that the law is just not being enforced or applied, not simply that it's being enforced or applied in ways that people would disagree with.
Right. Many jurisdictions don't have ability to pay hearings. And I've talked with attorneys, why isn't there more litigation around this? And attorneys say, well, you have to sit in jail. Your client will have to sit in jail through the time. So why not just sort of do whatever the court is mandating so that they can get out of jail? But yeah, many jurisdictions, and that's what we found, and that's what, we had a Blazina decision in Washington State, I'm not even gonna try and remember, maybe it was 2015, 2014, that mandated the law, right? That mandated that judges have ability to pay hearings. That's already the law. So it's kind of, people are recognizing, courts are recognizing that it's not happening, but to hold these courts accountable is really, really difficult.
And I'll just follow up and say, you're talking about coming up with a new pattern to color in and new crayons, but given that there is this law on the books already that just isn't being enforced, as part of the frustration that there are some resources in the legal apparatus that could be better made use of. Is that the exception in your study of the criminal justice system, that there are these Supreme Court laws and other laws that are simply not being enforced? Or is this just one of a pattern of other existing laws that are not being enforced?
I would argue, but I don't have evidence, but I would argue that it is a pattern. If it happens here, it's going to happen in other sorts of cracks and crevices of policy decisions in our court system. But I wouldn't say that, if we fix ability to pay hearings, everything's great. The system of monetary sanctions is inherently flawed and a bad system in general for American society. So I would say we need to do away with that.
Thanks for your talk. It was great. I guess it's a sociological question about the differences between counties and states.
Yeah.
So I was curious, you see those big differences in fines and fees by county. We see them by state as well. How do you come to understand those differences in terms of what you think is behind that, where one county is so high and another is low? There's a number of things, including history and judges and how dense the county is, how many people are there, how well the interactions, segregation, isolation, and of course race. So I was wondering if you could speak to that. It sounds like that analysis wasn't run, but you probably have some ideas.
So I have to use my hands to put that down. So I have a 2011 paper where we did do statistical analysis, and it was HLM. So we looked at county level demographic factors and individual level factors. And we found some interesting things, so counties that had higher voting in the prior election, conservative, sentenced to higher fines and fees. So that goes to the culture of that jurisdiction. We found interesting in that paper, interesting interactions. So in counties with higher populations of African Americans, anyone, regardless of race or ethnicity, that was charged with a violent crime, so higher African American, anyone charged with a violent crime received higher fines and fees. In counties with higher populations of Latino populations, Latinx populations, anyone convicted of drug offenses received higher fines and fees. And so it was just these weird so we argue that the racial context of the county shaped what crimes were deemed as more serious, and obviously a stereotype linking between race and different types of crimes. So there are other things we statistically controlled for. So men in the analysis, Latinos were charged higher fines and fees. I didn't talk about this. Sorry, I won't talk about it too much. But I have right now an 8-state study. We're in 8 states. I guess I didn't put the slide up here. I have an 8-state study replicating and expanding what I did in Washington. So 8 states, we have over 900 interviews. Observations, did exactly what I did in Washington, but across our 8 states. And we have automated court data from most of the states. And so we're trying to replicate that ASR paper across state data, and we're doing that right now. So we'll be able to do HLM, look at what are, and is it similar across different states? So I'm trying to get at that. Yeah, thanks for that question. Oh.
So it's really interesting work and very ambitious work. 50 states and lots of county, and so it's huge data collection. So, but in addition to the policy issue, I was wondering about thinking about sociological theory and theories of stratification, because in some ways, in the book you talk about neoliberalism, and the rise of neoliberalism and how that's changed issues. But I'm wondering about what this teaches us about theories about the reproduction of inequality. Because a lot of research, including my own, is about class, or we look at race. But it seems like you have this sort of implicit theory about organizational variation, and that the organizational variation is what is crucial. And I mean, you also have the law and surveillance, right? But I'm trying to think, well, how do we need to modify our models of inequality and how inequality is perpetuated across time? And partly you're saying, okay, these are embodied in the law, and the law is replicating inequality. But then you have this variation in bureaucratic variability. And because of bureaucrats and their implementation. And that it's not random, right? They have these various meritocratic views, and they're shaping their behavior. So you would think that maybe Democratic clerks who are more liberal might, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts about that versus Republicans, et cetera. But you're saying that where you happen to be caught, your jurisdiction is going to shape your life chances in crucial ways. And if we're looking at a bigger theory, say of healthcare, or education, or housing, that we need to look more seriously at this organizational structure and how it delivers services.
I guess my response, there's like a lot of different, my brain's kind of on fire right now because there's a lot of different directions I would want to say. But I think that to think more broadly about reproduction of inequality, and if I encourage you to look at different institutions, that one bubble overhead, is to think about where and how discretion is built into different processes. So I teach social problems. We talk about health disparities, educational disparities, criminal justice disparities. Same negative outcomes for pretty much similar situated groups. It's not because of individual behavior. It's because of built-in structural inequalities within these institutions. So I think that a general call sort of to action or for analysis would to think about where is the discretion and how might that discretion be used to disadvantage certain groups. And where are spaces in which we can equalize or advance or help support marginalized groups within those institutions. I think I tried to do sort of macro, micro. So macro, the system of monetary sanctions is bad all around. Even in the least punitive county, it's a bad system. But being on the ground as an ethnographer, I thought it was really interesting to see even the variation. So it's even worse in certain spaces. I think that helps to bolster some type of argument that the law and practice in certain institutions, because of discretion built into statutes, policies, whatever, guiding the ways in which those institutions act, can vary dramatically. And I think that might pull on the heartstrings of some people who think we live in a just, equal society. And if there's inequality in treatment, across one county border, then it's wrong. So I guess I was thinking about different ways to show empirically how unfair and egregious the system is.
But if I can just follow up then, like there was a study in Florida of sentencing by race, and with people it was a newspaper who did it, and they had they had the crime and if it was violent, et cetera, and it was like sometimes judges cut people breaks, but they almost always did this more with white, especially white middle class people than other people. But it seems like the irony is that you're suggesting more bureaucracy as a solution to reduce discretion, right?
I don't know if establishing criteria and giving explicit direction on how to apply the law is more bureaucracy or just more guidelines of how to create more consistent outcomes if you will, fair, even though I don't think it's a fair system, but more fair or similar outcomes, consistent outcomes for individuals. I don't know, I mean, I guess, I don't know. I don't know if that's bureaucracy or if that's, I think it's even easier and it would create more consistency. But again, it's arguing, that's changing the color within a system that's fraught with problems. So we could even step backwards and say, or step outside of it and say, let's have a broader discussion about, do we need this system, or is there a different way to work with people who we view have violated the law?
I thought I heard you say in response to Marie that you were skeptical that these fees and fines were actually leading to net revenues, even for the counties that were employing them. And if that's the case, how do we explain why they've been implemented? I know there's a narrative for suppressing marginalized people, a narrative of if I were Dr. Evil, and sadly maybe these are explanations. But thinking within the context of neoliberalism, if we want to use that as a paradigm, what would be the motivation then for implementing financially ineffective means of raising revenue?
The desire to punish, the desire to control. And there is money being generated. I mean, Washington made $30 million in 1 year. So there is some money that's being generated that can fund. One county I found, they posted their detailed budget of their court, and they have LFO clerks, LFO courts, and they fund those clerks and courtrooms from the LFOs that they recoup. So money is being generated. I just argue if we contrast with that money with what's being actually spent, then we're not going to have a payoff. But I think that there is this is part of the, sort of the American ethos, is to punish people. And there's this notion that we have to keep giving them more and more and more. Outside of the United States, they have day fines in different parts of the world, and that's done in lieu of incarceration. Here, I call it the punishment pie. If you sat in a sentencing court, people have, months and months of incarceration in prison, or years, probation, drug and alcohol sentencing, fines, fees, restitution. They have to do victim panel classes. Maybe they'll have to do electronic home monitoring when they come home. There's a whole pie that people get. And for some reason, our legislators, because they have this imagery of who is the bad person, want to layer more and more penalties on top of that. That's, I think, the why. And that's what they say in interviews. The legislators I interviewed, from a middle class standpoint, in positions of power, being primarily white men, the people I interviewed with, that perspective, they see people as needing to be held accountable in any which way. One said, well, you buy a dress at Nordstrom's, you pay for it, right? People have to pay. People need the pound of flesh. That title came from a prosecutor who prosecuted sex offenders, but said, I want to get my pound of flesh. I'll do every fine and fee on a sex offender, right? Getting my pound of flesh. That's what, there's a sentiment. I think it's hard for maybe those in academia or removed from the criminal justice system can't understand that sentiment, but that's out there.
So, to me, the neoliberal part of it isn't just that it's making money for rich people or corporations. It's that it does go to accountability, but in a different sense. It's what is accountable for the fact that we live in such an unequal society. And the neoliberalism says what's accountable for it is not that there's an elite of rich people who are, sapping all the resources from everybody else, but that who's accountable for it are poor people. I mean, it's a weird way of thinking that how could it possibly, the most marginalized people are the ones who are accountable for our unequal system. And that's, to me, that's the neoliberal logic, that you've got to match capital accumulation with punishment in order to explain to the public why we live in such a patently unjust system. And that to me is what your work shows so well, that the injustice isn't so much to me the difference between the counties. I mean, I think that's really important. But the difference between what happens to poor people and wealthy people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I mean, I really encourage you to stick with this idea that it's the whole structure. Like it does allow a lot of discretion county by county, but overall it allows for the perpetual punishment of the most marginalized people. And that's what I think is your work just screams. So
And it's purposeful. That's the thing that gets, I came into academia naive. I was one of the grad students that wanted to change the world. And I just thought that policymakers didn't have the right information, right? And so I'm still naive at these different points of my career of findings, is that this is done on purpose in our name and that's what I wanted the title of the book to be, a pound of flesh, a permanent punishment for the poor. And then the editor thought it was too long. But that's what it is. It's a permanent punishment that individuals have under the guise, the paternalistic guise, one, this rhetoric that we're making money, but two, that no, we're helping them become better citizens, but we're ignoring the fact that they live in poverty, that we failed their schools, that we have no health care, that the criminal justice system has failed them, but then the system also is delegitimated because of this. I mean, it's just, there's so many ironies that I can't make. It's hard for me to make sense of it, I think. Yeah.
But, so if I could just follow up
Sure.
with a question about this, then it is possible to understand the unfairness of it, not in a way that counters the idea that, well, it's fair to punish these people for the harm they've committed, or it's fair that they give restitution to the victims. By focusing on the injustice of the excessive punishment, I mean, it's unjust to punish someone beyond their sentence, which is what this is doing, and it's unjust to punish people because they're poor. I think in the context of bail reform, that's been a pretty successful argument, and I'm just wondering if there's any momentum in a movement based on the unfairness or injustice of this to get, I suppose, legislation. I don't know, class action lawsuits or something.
We had really, I want to say we still have good momentum. I mean, we had in 2015, this sort of came on the radar of the Obama DOJ. And so I was fortunate to be able to participate in a DOJ convening, connecting poverty with the criminal justice system and the issues, talking about that. And then there was a White House convening. And they used the conversation to create a white paper. And then the white paper was then used as evidence for, I don't know if Lisa Foster wrote the Dear Colleague letter that went out, so reminding judges you can't incarcerate, about Bearden v. Georgia, right? So reminding judges of the law, you can't incarcerate for, so they did that. They seeded the Bureau of Justice Administration, these 5 state grants that Washington has won. They created the National Task Force. So I think that the federal government at the time under Obama did as much as they could. From that, states have had some momentum. There's created this Fines and Fees Justice Center. If you're interested in this, finesandfees.org. And there's a lot of momentum. And the way that they're framing it is all about poverty, and they have campaigns around loss of driver's license. California has been doing a lot of legislative changes, no more juvenile fines and fees, because this happens to minors as well, who legally can't work. And then in some jurisdictions doing away with costs at sentencing. So there are incremental changes, but I really think our attention needs to focus on state legislatures dramatically doing away with these. But I'll work with anybody around incremental changes as well, right, for addressing immediate needs. Yeah, we have something called reconsideration days in Washington State where people, volunteer judges and prosecutors, people can go. 2 days, we had 1,000 people show up in one county. 3 million was waived, discretionary. So there are there's movement. Yeah.
So, a couple questions. One, have you ever given any thought to the relationship between technological innovation and the impact it's having on our labor markets, and particularly low-paying kinds of repetitious jobs, and the ability of people to pay the fines, to pay the pound of flesh. Has that ever come up in your travels, in your discussions? And the second one is on the matter of conspiracy. I didn't hear what you said. You said you're not a conspiracy theorist.
I was kind of joking. Yeah.
Okay, so what comes to mind is RICO, and that these officials, over a long period of time, see each other at conferences and compare notes and experiences and even innovations in how to go about extracting a pound of flesh.
Yep.
So to the extent that this happens in every state, and you've got thousands upon thousands of officials who see and know each other and trust each other to call each other up and say, hey, how do we go about doing this? What are you guys doing? Again, RICO comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And has that ever come up in your travels? This notion of crafting some sort of legal approach to the pound of flesh portion of this, not the restitution portion, but that pound of flesh, those egregious charges. RICO's serious, you know, and I think that it should rise to that level. I mean, based on some things that I've heard and other people in this room have heard about this matter, I would think that municipalities and these government officials need to be shaken violently.
Yeah.
And RICO does that.
So, okay, so a lot of things. There are, like you said, there are companies, third-party entities that go and have conferences and work with local jurisdictions and work with them on how to try and improve recoupment efforts through technology. I don't know if I'm linking everything right here. And generate money that way. So tax anticipation fund. So there's this whole program that different companies are selling states and local jurisdictions to go and try and intercept people's tax money as their LFOs. So I'm trying to figure out where I want to go with this. There have been a great deal of attempts at class action lawsuits where firms have come and I've consulted with, sort of talking about the ways in which third-party companies are being used by local jurisdictions to force a service upon individuals, and those individuals have to pay for the service. But they haven't gone anywhere yet. They're still in the courts. I can say this because there's newspaper articles about this. There's one case where, well, in many jurisdictions, if I'm arrested and I have cash on me and I have to spend the night in jail, they take my they take everything, but they take the cash. When I'm released and not even prosecuted, they don't give me my money back. They take my money and they put it on a debit release card, right? To access my money, I have to pay to get my money. If I'm from Canada and I need my money right away, or I have to try and access my money in Canada, I live in Washington State, so we're close to the border, that's why I say Canada, I have to pay extra. If I don't access my money, they charge weekly maintenance fees. So there are attempts at class action suits. I don't know if that's sort of what you're asking about, kind of, sort of. That's where my mind is going, to try and address. And the way that they get away with it is that upon release, they give you a form. Like, you're ready to get out of jail and go home, take a shower, get your own underwear on, right? You sign a form in order to get your debit release card. And on that form, you're voluntarily agreeing to enter. But is that really a voluntary process that you're engaging in? So that's sort of what I'm thinking. Do you have other ideas about types of litigation, class action?
No, I'm wondering
Who is doing this?
Are there
ACLU is really big on this. Both the state affiliates and national ACLU have different campaigns. In Washington right now, they're looking at third-party private collection companies, and that's 50% additional, but then the different types of means that they're trying to use to recover the money, threats of, where they have no authority whatsoever, but threats of incarceration, things like that. That's all I can think of right now. I'm sorry. But Fines, Fees, Justice Center, if you go there, there's tons. Fines, Fees, Justice Center. They really keep a good clearinghouse on up-to-date both litigation and research. Thanks for the question. Hi.
I have a simple question.
Sure.
Any course, when you were talking to any of these people, realize that the system has been unconstitutional for a long, long time, and it started with the introduction of bar associations. Anybody know this?
I don't know the relationship with the bar associations.
The justice system was a bar of justice before bar associations. Now it's more like the crown judicial system rather than the constitutional judicial system. For example, the drug laws are unconstitutional, and most of the people that are in jail are in jail related to drug laws. Is there anybody that you're talking to? Because our problem really is ignorance of what our system is supposed to be. That's what I'm bringing up.
Yeah, I don't. Particularly the decision makers and people with power in the court system don't frame the court system that way. They view and argue that what they do is 100% legitimate.
It's right. Yeah, I know, but it's not.
No, well,
That's my question. Does anybody, people you're talking to, have a clue about the reality of the situation?
They don't talk about that. I think definitely the people who have come into contact with the criminal justice system frame it as being very unfair and
beyond unfair, it's actually unconstitutional.
yeah, no, that hasn't come up. Yeah, but thank you for that.
The Tim's case was pretty encouraging.
Definitely encouraging. Yeah, with the seizure, the forfeiture of a man's Range Rover, I think it was $42,000. It was a $42,000 car. He had purchased the car. His father had died, left him money. He purchased this $42,000 car. He would buy drugs, and he actually went to purchase drugs, didn't have the car with him, and was arrested. And the total fine or fee allowable was less than $42,000, but they still took his car. And it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court found it was really about whether or not the excessive fines and fees clause could be applied to states. And the Supreme Court said that it could, and now it's back. And now people are thinking, there's a legal scholar who I adore, Beth Colgan at UCLA Law, who,
She was my student.
Oh, was she? I honestly did not know that. I did not know that. I always talk about her. But she writes on this. Yeah, I will. She writes on this issue a lot of sort of constitutionality of the criminal justice system. So I think you would find her work very interesting. Yeah.
Most of this, there's no corpus delicti, so people are being incarcerated, and basically it's like we're still in Europe, where the king is in charge, and you can just be strung up for anything.
That illustrates or what I've seen, particularly in juvenile courts when I did research in juvenile courts, that the judge was the king of the court and ruled that court. And I mean, I can tell you stories about what he would make public defenders do in his courtroom, and yeah.
Again, my question is, have you encountered any people that have a clue about this so we can actually get educating the general public so we can get them under this new tyranny?
I have not, sir, but if you would send me articles or suggest a book, I'd be happy to read more and think about it more.
Well,
Thank you.
This is a cutting-edge talk, and I'm sure we'll be hearing more about in the future. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. I appreciate it.